you made a remark to me recently, and I'm gonna mention it detached from the context in which in which the remark was made. You said something about the narrowing of Catholic intellectual life, and you said specifically in the last decade. Well, you said here. I'll just read what you said, if you don't mind. You said,
Hmm. Sure.
in the last decade, it seems to me traditional Catholicism has gone from being the place of the greatest intellectual vitality to a philistinism that is the mirror image of the contemporary left. This climb, wait, let's see. That context is not a sign of a restored doctrinal seriousness among Catholics. It is rather the extension of secular leftist illiberal censoriousness into the church, which is the smoke of Satan as much as the spread of modernism and unbelief within the church has been. Now, I assume when you say illiberal, we did a whole podcast criticizing liberalism, even in its sort of like original variety. So I assume I shouldn't read too much into your use of that particular word, but I'm kind of interested in knowing what you're talking about more generally in Catholic intellectual life.
Yeah. Well, so without naming names,
Sure,
I,
absolutely, yeah,
I'm increasingly concerned about what I'm seeing among uh, more traditional, to use that phrase for a second, traditional Catholics. I don't like that phrase traditional, and I loathe the phrase trad. I think uh,
hmm
it's frightening how people who would stand athwart the image of the age are reproducing themselves in the kind of handy little tags that our consumer culture um, bequeaths to us. We want to stand outside of
mm.
those things rather than simply have our own little brand of them, uh, our own little consumer choice of a particular kind of dogma. Um, so, so forgive the language there, but I I think the difference in the last 10 years, and it's hard to really take the measure of how significant this particular kind of division is. Um, but from what I can tell from afar, and I am in my own way kind of afar because we're all so relatively isolated these days for not just through quarantine but through social media, etc. But um, 10 years ago, it seemed that the two most robust divisions within the church, or the great robust division in the church, was between a graying um, spirit of Vatican II liberalism and an intellectually serious, doctrinally serious. Um, I'm going to use the phrase conservative Catholicism, but that's inadequate to it. Just a more authentic Catholicism um, that took seriously both the great achievements of the intellectual and spiritual achievements of the church in the 19th and early 20th century, and took also very seriously the great benefits of the ressourcement that that great theological generation, including de Lubac and von Balthasar and Pope Emeritus Benedict, were all included in that. Those were the two chief divisions, and within that latter camp, certainly I knew many people who were uh, in the St. Pius X Society and had certain further eccentricities beyond that, but there was a general consensus of what a doctrinally serious and authentic and in communion with the church Catholicism looked like. And there was a sense that there were a clear sense that there was still live among us a very lamentable departure from that orthodoxy. What I
Mm.
see now is is a further division or branching off where people who are authentically drawn to the Catholica, who want to be transformed by Christ and by his church and be integrated into his mystical body fully through the sacraments, um, that in the pursuit of doing that, they're looking for shortcuts, and those shortcuts um, are often expressed by simply pretending that they can construct their own orthodoxy out of a handful of cherry-picked church documents. And then what I think is worse than that is they can misread those documents, especially say the documents condemning modernism, and
Hmm.
uh, and then the whole world begins to look like a series of modernist heretics. And the story
Hmm.
continues. There are people who I suppose you might call demagogues. Um, you might also call them pseudo intellectuals, who
Hmm.
claim to be really good at interpreting and discerning the difference between an authentic and an orthodox theology, and the modernism that has invaded the church. Which they're right, it has invaded the church. It's in the church. We know that. That's not in question. Um,
Hmm.
but they're just taking a butcher's cleaver and trying to lop everything away in hopes
Right.
that they will be saved. And I mean the number of criticisms one could level at this uh, are are probably more than I can count on my fingers. I mean the part of it is one thing I want to begin with very briefly is um, I noticed years ago amongst people who are really like me, a propensity to substitute talking about church politics for actually talking about the spirituality and the doctrines of the church. And
Yeah.
that is a
Yeah.
kind of shortcut spirituality. You just keep hoping, oh, I hope John Paul II is going to finally appoint that conservative bishop. And here I hear this rumor. That kind of chatter actually substitutes for an authentic engagement with the faith.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and now it seems to be pullulating through conspiracy theories, which of course I'm with everybody who says conspiracy theories aren't bad if they're true,
Right.
but through
Right.
very weak and unsubstantiated conspiracy theories that are serving a very convenient point. What is that
Yeah.
point? To create a simulacrum of thought where there in fact is none.
Hmm. So this seems to go to a certain extent with your recent essay on Maritain for Church Life Journal, right? I mean, that's the sort of thing that you're addressing, um, uh, but more by focusing on Maritain than on his critics. Of course, you're doing something very positive in that piece.
Yeah, indeed. You know, the attack on Marathon that I was responding to was more or less regurgitated from the 1930s, and I think the scholarly consensus was that there was not really a there. There was an unwillingness on the part of the great philosopher Deconic to hear what Marathon was writing, and uh, and then first of all, there were people who wanted to defend Marathon who wanted to hear him saying things he wasn't saying, and then there was
Hmm.
Marathon himself, I think, was charitable in refusing to engage DeConnick directly in this debate on personalism and the common good. Um, but he wrote, actually, of course, one of his great books, the very short one, "The Person and the Common Good," as a tacit response to DeConnick. And
Right.
there's nothing that Marathon says there that isn't also found in DeConnick's defense of church teaching. That was kind of a pseudo
Hmm.
controversy. What I think was occurring there is I think we all sense that something has gone deeply wrong both with our society, with our broader civilization and our culture, and within the church. And there's no question that it has. And in fact, so much has gone wrong that it's very lucrative, at least at least emotionally lucrative, to just go in search of villains. And that's becoming a substitute for actually simply recovering the doctrines of the church, and recovering an authentic practice. Just tarring everything with the word modernism, um, it simply won't do, and it's a gesture that makes pretenses of a rigorous and faithful orthodoxy, um, that's often rooted in a kind of ignorance, and including an ignorance of what modernism was. I mean, it's a very that modernism was a very specific, um, heresy within the history of the church. It's not just sort of the general uh, brush with which you can tar um, every departure from orthodoxy. Um, there's just
Right.
there we so much was lost. So much has been lost that that we as Catholics will be struggling to recover for generations if we ever do recover it.
Right.
It's 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 not surprising to me that the novel Canticle for Leibowitz seems to become more popular as a great Catholic novel as the years go on, because so many of us are living like um, barbarians trying to hold together or piece together the fragments of a tradition that we know was once whole, and that we don't have um, the architectonic view to put it all together adequately again. And that's the consequence of so many decisions at so many different places and times, that it's daunting to try to overcome it,
Yeah.
to overcome that obstacle. And so people are finding really quick children's scissors and paste way to do that, to overcome it. And they're not actually solving the problem. They're merely creating new, stranger
Yeah.
fragments. But the church tradition is whole, despite our massive forgetting, and we need to recover with patience that whole history, and also read it in light of the history. I mean, just very briefly, I've always been very moved by the early social encyclicals. The idea of a third way, um, the introduction of the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity, um, the understanding that liberalism and communism are both misguided, though one
Hmm.
perhaps worse than the other. Economic liberalism, I mean by that, classical
Yeah.
liberalism. Um, uh, those are all great and insightful things. But I think we need to recognize, um, in a document like Gaudium in Space, and then with John Paul II in the 90s with Centesimus Annus, excuse me, that the church was not just plain ideology the way so many contemporary political thinkers do when it wrote those social encyclicals. It was responding to real and specific threats to both the church and to peoples everywhere by industrialization and by the rise of trade union socialism and communism. And in the wake of the Second World War, the church's qualified endorsement of of the free market and the basic principles of economic liberalism that said, the best way to lift people out of poverty is the generation of greater wealth. Um, that was the church being limber and responsive to what was actually happening in history. So
Hmm.
we can't simply, so though we need to continue to read and admire the early social encyclicals, we can't merely lift them out of their context. And
Hmm.
when we look at the church's qualified endorsements of economic liberalism, we cannot simply lift those out of their context either and pretend that somehow the church has put paid to all imaginative social doctrine, and we've got it all solved. We're just gonna have the rising tide lift all boats. That's Neither of those things is true. The church is a living organization that has to, amongst many other things, um, uh, determine what is just, uh, for human beings at each given stage of history.